up, did Ben Shapiro just make an argument for systemic reparations? Ben Shapiro has decided to come after this anti-racist political advocate, Angela Davis. His attacks on her are absolute garbage.
Wonderful story. So Angela Davis is widely beloved by the left. She's an insanely radical, crazy person, full-on socialist.
So radical. So radical. She wants the government to, like, take care of people. She wants things like basic human needs to be provided for people. She wants things like reducing exploitation under capitalism. Oh my gosh, so radical, so crazy. Sounds pretty base to me.
On the FBI's most wanted list for years, because in August of 1970, she was apparently complicit in a bloody event in which she was charged with 3 capital offenses, including murder.
Notice how Ben Shapiro framed that. She was on the FBI's most wanted list. She was charged as being complicit in a crime which resulted in murder. When I heard that, that sounded fake. So I looked into it, and actually just finding her Wikipedia page was enough to debunk everything that he said. She's like an anti-racist socialist. Like, she's actually pretty based from what I've seen. What actually happened, there was this person who stole guns owned from her and ended up murdering people with those guns. The FBI thought that she was involved in those murders. It turns out a jury found her not guilty on all charges. The people that committed the murder just stole her guns without her permission. Ben Shapiro's gonna frame she was on the most wanted list. She was charged with being complicit in killing 3 people when she was found not guilty. So he's literally attacking her for a crime that she didn't commit, that she was found not guilty of. Fear-mongering extremely about something she was found not guilty of. Okay, bestie.
Right, the New York Times reported this. In 1969, Davis was an assistant professor in the philosophy department at the University of California, LA. She was fired at the beginning of the school year for her membership in the Communist Party. After a court ruled the termination illegal, she was fired again 9 months later for using inflammatory rhetoric in public speeches. She became close to a trio of black inmates nicknamed the Soledad brothers, who had been charged with the murder of a white prison guard in January 1970. One, George Jackson, was an actor.
By the way, the Soledad brothers were also found not guilty of that murder, which Ben Shapiro brought up. You can find this in the Wikipedia page on the Soledad brothers. So once again, trying to paint them as dangerous criminals and murderers, they were also found not guilty. So that's the second time we have pretended that people are dangerous criminals and murderers for things that they were found not guilty.
Activist and writer that Davis befriended. In August 1970, after Jackson's younger brother Jonathan used firearms registered to Angela Davis in a takeover of Marin County Courthouse that left 4 people dead, she came under suspicion because they were her guns that were used in the murders. J. Edgar Hoover placed Davis on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She was the 3rd woman ever to be included. There was a nationwide manhunt. President Nixon congratulated the Bureau on capturing the dangerous terrorist Angela Davis. And then, of course, the left decided that she was a wonderful person. She was a political prisoner. By a political prisoner, we mean that she apparently actively participated in, or allegedly actively participated in, an actual murder and jailbreak.
Notice how he said participated, allegedly participated. She was found not guilty of this, and then still going to say she participated, and then have to correct himself to allegedly because she was found not guilty. Yeah, she was chased down by the FBI because she was a suspect in this crime, but she was not guilty. This is kind of one of the ways that right-wing rhetoric in particular tries to paint minorities, especially black people, as criminals. They will dig up any kind of history within any kind of court case, even ones where they're found not guilty, and say, look at this, alleged crime, charged with a crime, make you think of this person as a criminal, as a murderer even, if you don't look any deeper into it. Angela Davis was found not guilty on all accounts, yet Ben is still trying to paint her this way.
And of course, she continues to be a terrible communist who has been propped up by the left, which is a thing that the left likes to do.
Can you cite me one, like, terrible communist thing that she's actually done or advocated for? So far, all that Ben Shapiro has had, things that she was found not guilty of by a jury. By the way, a jury in the 1970s found her not guilty. Racial bias in juries was a lot worse than it is now. Racial bias in juries is still absolutely a thing to this day that disproportionately affects people of color, but it was way worse 50 years from now. And even with that racial bias 50 years from now, she was found not guilty on all accounts.
They like to suggest, of course, that radicals who are communists are somehow better than radicals of other stripes, which is not true. Well, Angela Davis's entire life has been built on the notion that America is a deeply racist, terrible place, and that she is representative of under attack minorities.
Yeah, I think you can certainly make the claim that America was founded on white supremacist principles, and this led to policies such as chattel slavery, Jim Crow laws such as redlining, and that it's only been very recently, like since the 1960s, that black people have had equal rights to white people on the books. On the books is not the same thing as in practice. When you consider things like sundown towns where black people were murdered and police wouldn't do anything about it after sundown, when you consider things like racial bias in pulling people over in arrests, in juries, in judges, all of these things still exist to this day. But even on the books, there are black people who are alive today that didn't have the same rights as white people on the books when they were born, let alone in practice. You can absolutely make that claim.
Well, something very ironic happened to Angela Davis. She did Henry Louis Gates's show, which is all about ancestry. And there have been some kind of interesting moments on Henry Louis Gates' show before. So most famously, Ben Affleck did an episode in which he found out that he had a slaveholding ancestor, and he got very, very upset about this. Now, I think most normal people look at their ancestry and they're like, well, I can't change any of that, so who cares? But it was a big controversy at the time. Now, this one is pretty rich. Angela Davis is sitting there, and she finds out that one of her ancestors arrived on the American Mayflower, which means that for all of her anti-Americanism, one of her great-great-great-great-grandparents was one of the original American white settlers.
Okay, Ben, let's think about this for 1 second. If a black person in America today who also knows that they descended from slaves find out that they also have white ancestors, what happened? Their slave ancestors were sexually assaulted by slave masters who were white, resulting in pregnancy. This is a well-known historical fact. Many black people who live in the United States today can trace their lineage back to slave owners who sexually assaulted slaves. Yeah, that would be very distressing to find out. But Ben's not going to mention that, and then is just going to show the clip where she's distressed.
Yeah, man. Here's Henry Louis Gates with Angela Davis.
That is
Not
a
even
list
gonna
of
mention
passengers
that.
on the Mayflower.
No, I can't believe this. No, my ancestors did not come here on the Mayflower.
Your ancestors came on the Mayflower.
No.
You are descended
No.
from one of the 101 people who sailed on the Mayflower.
This is a bit of a weird time to get subscriptions, but thank you so much for the 5 gifted tier 1 subs, Post-Cultural Marxism. Obviously, if somebody finds out that they're the product of sexual assault, you're gonna have some pretty complicated feelings of that, including possible denial. That's what's happening here. Ben's not gonna mention that because Ben does not want people to think about the horrors of the racist history of this nation, which we still have not fixed in many ways, in which we can still fix. Things like biasing in jury convictions, things like biasing in police arrests, things like biasing in stop and search, for example, things like redlining, which the effects of redlining, although were ended roughly in the 1960s, still have impacts on the houses which black people were allowed to own up until the 60s, meaning that a lot of them weren't able to move out of these poorer areas since then. Living in poor communities is obviously going to have effect on the types of schools that your kids can go to, the types of opportunities they have. These are things which we can address through systemic reparation, where we specifically target these undervalued communities and we fix them up. We invest in better education, better schooling, better public transportation, better housing. All of these things we can do, but we're not doing them.
That's a little bit too much to deal with right now.
Did you ever, in your wildest dreams, think that you may have descended from people who laid
Never.
the foundation
Never.
for this country?
Never.
Okay, so her disbelief and her kind of shock, and she obviously looks a little bit upset about this.
Yes, because it implies that she was the product of sexual assault.
Kind of amazing, right? America is an amazing place in which Angela Davis's ancestors from, obviously the black side of her family, victimized in the United States, obviously.
Yeah, they were victimized by the white side of her family, but Ben's not going to mention that.
But also, it means that some of the founders of the United States are in her lineage. So I'm not sure which side of her pays reparations to the other side, but her entire notion, which is that America is a terrible place of racial oppression and brutality, then that means she has to look into her own ancestry, right? There's always this awkward problem with history. And the awkward problem with history is that it's filled with bad people and good people and people on all sides, and many of them are in your genealogy. And what that means is no one is responsible for their own genealogy. And trying to blame all present evils on genealogy or trying to blame it on ancestry is a sign of a sick civilization.
Okay, but nobody's doing that. When people on the left claim that systemic racism is real, What we're saying is that history has consequences, that racist policies in the past and racist biases which still exist today, those result in worse outcomes for people along the lines of marginalized races. I've never seen an actual leftist make the claim that all injustice in America can be attributed to racism, and that if people just stopped being racist on an interpersonal level, that would solve everything. Nobody's claiming that. What we're claiming is that history has consequences, and we've really not made up for those consequences. Just making things on the books equal still doesn't resolve all of the ways in which poorer communities, particularly communities of color, have been forced into poorer regions and have not been given the same level of access to educational resources, to infrastructural resources. But we could allocate them to those communities. We could allocate those to these poorer communities. And you don't even have to do this along racial lines. You can do this along economic lines and raise everybody up. The right is never going to talk about that.
Angela Davis might realize that history is complex and weird and ugly and strange and shocking. We should, instead of attempting to blame all problems in the United States on ancestry,
No one's
we should
doing
attempt
that.
to figure out solutions for the here and now.
Hold up. Did Ben Shapiro just make an argument for systemic reparations? Hold up. Ben Shapiro actually just made the argument for systemic reparations. That history has consequences, and in the here and now, we can address those negative consequences. Wow, if only Republicans actually supported any kind of policy which would do that, like funding education, like funding infrastructure, going along economic lines to improve the access to these resources. Wow, Ben Shapiro just made the argument.
That is some pretty amazing stuff.